All right, ladies and gentlemen, I am going to call another audible here as it relates to this podcast. Hopefully you won't mind, but I have good reason to this time. So we're not going to delve into Revelation chapter 11 like we said we were going to do last time. However, what we're going to talk about is related to the general topic of eschatology. So we're not leaving that field. We're just not going to be continuing on into Revelation chapter 11 this time. I anticipate that we will do that next time, but I have a special reason to take a pause on that while still talking about eschatology. You'll find out why as we go through this podcast. So I hope you stay with us. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. All right. Well, if you've been with me for the past several weeks, you know that number one, you know that we've been going through a study of the Book of Revelation, and I think that we've again, I can only speak for myself here. That I think that we've had a good journey up to this point. We've gone all the way through Revelation chapter 10. Still got quite a bit of real estate to go as we explore that book. I'm going to be looking forward to going through the rest of that in the weeks to follow, especially when we get to places like Revelation chapter 19, Revelation chapter 20. I would actually say even before that, even Revelation chapter 13. There's so many things that are housed in those chapters that a lot of people have a lot of questions about, are wondering about certain things, and I think that there are answers to those questions, and I'm looking forward to getting to those things when we get there. So I'm really excited about what lays ahead as it relates to our study of the Book of Revelation. But the second thing that you know, if you've been with us for a while, is that one thing that I've announced over the past several weeks is my book, Signs of the End. That I would say is going to be coming out. Well, it is finally available for purchase, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, and in fact, I have it right here. I have one of my complimentary copies right here in my hand. So again, the book is Signs of the End, and the subtitle is "What Did Jesus Say About His Own Return and the Events That Point to It?" Okay, so I think this is going to be a good complimentary resource that you can read also as we're going through the Book of Revelation in this podcast. Now, obviously in the book, there are several references to things in the Book of Revelation, especially the second to last chapter. But overall, the main thing that we're looking at here is Jesus's words in his Olivet Discourse. So this book isn't an overview of Revelation or a study of the Book of Revelation or anything like that, even though obviously, given the subject matter, there are several references to the Book of Revelation. Okay, so while in the podcast we're going through Revelation, this book kind of takes a little bit more of a narrower sort of look at things, just as it relates to what Jesus himself says, and it deals specifically with his words to his disciples in the Olivet Discourse. The Olivet Discourse, of course, that passage of Scripture where Jesus talks about the signs of his coming and of the end of the age. You find that in Matthew 24, Mark chapter 13, and in Luke chapter 21. So just to give you a little bit of a background here in this, I mean, it's not a huge story or huge background or anything, but this actually stems back from several years ago. I would want to say maybe probably 2013, around there, probably around this time of year in 2013. I think it was around summertime. What I was teaching through in 2013 was during the summer. But even before that, one of the things that we had at our church during this time was Sunday evening teaching. Not a church service or anything, and this wasn't anything that everybody in the congregation attended. I mean, you just had a handful of people who were interested, who would come and attend this Bible study. which wasn't taught by me. It was taught by somebody else. And what he was teaching through during this time was he was teaching through the book of Mark. And when he came up to Mark chapter 13, which is the chapter that highlights Jesus's Olivet Discourse, he asked me if I wanted to teach through Mark chapter 13. And the reason why he asked me to do that is because he knew that my perspective on the Olivet Discourse, and even eschatologically as it relates to other prophecy texts, and even with the book of Revelation, is different than from what a lot of people in the Bible study held, including the teacher himself. I mean, me and the teacher held a different view on the second coming at that time. And so most of the people there had been exposed to and really embraced, I think most of them anyway, a dispensational premillennial understanding of the end times. And so this teacher asked, I would like you to teach through Mark 13 from your perspective so that people can have another perspective on how to look at this. Now, and let me just say right off the bat here, just so nobody gets the wrong idea. When I'm talking about my perspective, it's not like this is a very unique Steve Gill sort of perspective on the end times. My view on the end times, and I think I've mentioned this near the beginning of our time going through the book of Revelation, is in a particular camp. It's not something that I have on my own and I stand alone in this one view of eschatology, the book of Revelation, and that sort of thing. There's in the realm of theological doctrinal discussion and scholarship, the view that I hold is one that is very widely known. Okay, but I thought that was a very interesting request that this person had asked of me. I mean, just given that we didn't see eye to eye necessarily on the end times, but he wanted me to teach Mark 13 from that perspective, so that the other people in the class could be exposed to another way of looking at the text and looking at eschatology all around. So I did. I taught through that chapter. It was probably, I'd say, maybe 5 or 6 weeks that I spent teaching through Mark chapter 13. I mean, I don't think that, in order to really get to the roots of where I come from and challenging some of the other things of how, that passage is interpreted, is not something that you're going to cover in about a week. I think, if I remember correctly, I think that's what I originally thought the teacher was asking me to do, was take 1 week to explain Mark 13 from my perspective. And I was kind of, okay, well, goodness, there's so many things that need to be laid out here. I don't know if I can do it in one particular class. But then he clarified. He said, no, you're going to have more than 1 week. So I was like, okay, good. Now I'm glad that I have that. So all that to say is that really this book is a product of what comes from that class, not in an exact form. What was taught in the class is just kind of actually really more of a skeletal sort of structure than from what you have in the book. And that's basically because of time constraints and things like that with teaching. There were still certain things that I couldn't really go in depth on as I was going through that, but I could in the book. Okay, so the book isn't exactly a one-for-one sort of thing from notes that I took and that I taught from in that class transferred over into the book. There's a lot of things from the class that are in the book, obviously, but there's a certain extension and expansion of certain things as well that I wasn't able to cover when I taught through that. So really, that's where this book comes from. And so, like I said, this was during a time where the teacher was going through Mark 13, going through the Gospel of Mark, and so therefore I was teaching from Mark chapter 13. And so the Mark version of the Olivet Discourse is the main text that I draw from. A lot of people usually go to Matthew, and if I was writing anything of this, and I hadn't taught that class, I probably would have gravitated toward Matthew 24 because that's kind of where we usually land on when it comes to the Olivet Discourse. But I mean, really, there's a lot of similarities between Matthew and Mark. So at the end of the day, there might not be too big of a difference. I don't think that it's that big of a deal. But even though I draw from Mark 13 in the book, obviously we do a little bit of comparison work between Mark's version and Matthew's version and Luke's version. I think that is absolutely necessary so that we can put all the pieces of the puzzle together and understand what Jesus is talking about here. And so that's kind of the background that we have with the book. And so I just figured what I would do on this episode is just give you a little bit of a preview of what we're dealing with here. And I thought I would do that by just kind of making you all aware of just kind of the background of what's and just kind of what's going on leading up to the Olivet Discourse, up to what the disciples asked Jesus about regarding the temple and regarding the end of the age. When will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Okay, so there's actually going to be quite a bit of reading here going on here, but I think it's going to be good for us. And I'm going to start out in Matthew here, Matthew chapter 23. Obviously, Matthew 23, right before Matthew 24, right, which is where the Olivet Discourse is in Matthew's account. And one thing that we have to understand, just in a broad sense, when we read the Gospels and we read about our Savior's ministry here on earth, one thing that we know, if we're familiar with Scripture, is that you have these annoying people called the scribes and the Pharisees, who are always looking for something to accuse Jesus about, because these were the natural enemies of Jesus Christ. And it seems like they pop up everywhere, and you wish that they would go away. But I mean, these are the natural antagonists of Jesus as he was going about his ministry. And you see them popping up all over the place. But you definitely see more of those encounters between Jesus and the religious leaders after his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. So you know his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, less than a week before he's going to be crucified in Jerusalem. You remember, people were shouting hosannas and laying palm branches and their robes before Jesus as he was riding in on a donkey. So on an overall perspective, just from the people of Jerusalem anyway, again, people who were there who are going to be celebrating the Passover, there seemed to be a positive reception to Jesus at that time. Now, obviously, by the end of the week, most of those people are going to be screaming for his blood. But at the outset there, as Jesus is coming in, it seems to be a positive response. But that doesn't mean that Jesus isn't going to face any more, of these argumentative encounters that he has with the religious leaders. And you see that, in quite a few places, questioning him about taxes and Caesar, about questioning him about the resurrection and, those sorts of things. And it gets to a point actually where after there's one of these encounters and Jesus answers them, answers their objections or whatever. Scripture says that from that point on, they dared ask him no more questions. Okay. And it's at that point you're like, okay, great. Jesus has shut them up for good. Okay. And we should just leave it at that, right? Wrong. That's not what Jesus does here. Jesus, at least as it relates to Matthew's account, I don't think the whole thing of they dared to ask him no more. Oh, actually, it does show up in Matthew in chapter 22, verse 46, the last verse of that chapter there, and it says, "And no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions." So that's what you have there. Now, as you go into chapter 23, you have these series of woes that Jesus lays out against the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. And right there at the beginning of chapter 23, it says, "Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples." Okay, so he's speaking to his disciples and he's speaking to the crowds. Okay, so the crowd is kind of a mixed bag, you can say. Even though a lot of people received him and were singing hosannas, You wonder what their thinking is, just kind of as this is going on and as Jesus lays out these woes in chapter 23. Let me go ahead and skip down over to verse 13 and start from there. You get it. We're going to get it. We're going to get a good dose of what Jesus it says to these people here, or about them. So he says in verse 13 of chapter 23 in Matthew, "But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. For you neither enter yourselves, nor allow those who would enter to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte, and when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, if anyone swears by the temple, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by his oath. You blind fools! For which is greater, the gold or the temple that has made the gold sacred? And you say, if anyone swears by the altar, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift that is on the altar, he is bound by his oath. You blind men! For which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? So whoever swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. And whoever swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. And whoever swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside you are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisees, first clean the inside of the cup and the plate, and the outside will also may be so that that the outside also may be clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. So you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Now, let me just stop right there. That was verses 13 through 28. So, and Jesus isn't done. We're going to finish the rest of this, but you get the idea here of, just, and listen, this isn't a matter of Jesus just kind of reaching his limit and he just loses his temper and he just goes on this, it just unleashes this diatribe on these people, on the Jewish crowds and the Jewish religious leaders. That's not what's happening at all. Basically, Jesus is just telling it the way that it is. It's interesting that in Mark's version, in chapter 12, right before you get into chapter 13, chapter 12 doesn't have what we read here in Matthew 23. That's missing in Mark, but we do have the telling of the account of Jesus and looking at the widow who gave her small mite in the offering, and how Jesus said that she gave more than everybody else who put in large sums of money. We have to understand something here. A lot of people, including myself at one point, I've looked at that sort of passage and it said that this is a teaching that shows the example of very selfless, sacrificial giving. Listen, if you understand the situation at the time, that's not what's going on. What was going on is that the religious system at that time was taking advantage of people like widows who were doing things like that because they thought that it was required of them, and they thought that God wouldn't bless them if they didn't give all that they had. Okay, so really this goes into something that Jesus says a little bit later, I believe, in that passage where he's talking about the religious leaders and saying that they devour widows' houses. This is an example of that right there. So because of that in that passage, Jesus says the people of that religious system will be judged most severely. Okay, and then we get into the whole thing of Matthew chapter 13. But if we kind of harmonize with the text between places like that, Mark, and what we have here in Matthew, I think you can understand a little bit, especially when Jesus says that these are the people who are going to be judged most severely. Then we look at somewhere here like Matthew chapter 13, and you hear what Jesus says here. You can understand where all of that is coming from. But listen, strong words from our Savior himself, right? I don't think any of us can really imagine ever going to, addressing things like this to a crowd of people and using words like this. And who knows? Maybe we should at some point. I don't know. But Jesus was not afraid to tell things as it really was, and certainly strong language here. Now, what he's going to do here, as you get further into chapter 23, is going to predict the desolation of the temple itself. Okay, which, trust me, that is no small thing. That is no small thing whatsoever at all. Okay, but let's pay attention as we continue into Matthew 23 here. What leads into that whole thing of Jesus pronouncing this judgment that's going to fall on the temple? Okay, so it says here I'm going to pick up in verse 29 of Matthew 23, where he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous, saying, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. Thus you witness against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your fathers." Okay, so this is that's something else. And at first glance, if we just take that small portion there, which again, that was verses 29 through 31, one might think, okay, is Jesus saying there that just by virtue of being descendants of the forefathers before, that they would be, that they would have to suffer the consequences of what their forefathers did before when they killed the prophets? Because Jesus seems to be saying, look, you yourselves, by putting on this performance, by putting on this show of saying, if we wouldn't have treated the prophets this way, we wouldn't have done this. Oh. Jesus is saying, no, actually you are testifying against yourselves when you're carrying on like this. And so he says there, in verse 32, actually, fill up then the measure of your fathers. In other words, that's just another way of saying this is, just the same sort of eternal consequences and even physical consequences at that time as they were persecuting the prophets. What they filled up as far as the measurement of God's wrath against them, you should expect as well. Now, that's not something that's saying just because of your blood relation to your forefathers before you that you carry on that guilt. Remember in Ezekiel chapter 18, it talks about the fathers shall not die for the sins of the sons, and the sons should not die or be punished for the sins of their fathers. So if that's the case, and if that's the principle that we can look at here as far as how all of that works, what are we looking at here? Well, if we read further, we understand why Jesus says what he says there. Because if you go in verse 33 and following, it says, "You serpents, you brood of vipers, how will you escape? How are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, listen to this, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute them from town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." Okay, so notice what's going on here. So the forefathers, in times past, persecuted and killed the prophets. The people in Jesus' generation are saying, "Oh, that's so terrible. That would have, that we never would have allowed that to happen if we were living in that day." But Jesus is pointing out, he says, I'm going to be sending you prophets and apostles, and some of you are going, and you're going to persecute them, and you're going to chase them from town to town, and you're going to kill and crucify some of them, and others you're going to flog in their synagogues. And for that reason, you are going to be punished, and you're going to be responsible for the blood of the prophets, from righteous Abel to the blood of Berechiah. Why? Because the prophets and apostles that Jesus are talking to are going to be of the same, are going to work on the same foundation as the prophets of old. The prophets of old spoke of Jesus Christ, spoke about him, his upcoming ministry, and the apostles and prophets from Jesus on speaks of his fulfillment. Okay. The whole thing of the Christian gospel is built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, according to Ephesians 2. So for these people, it's not going to make a lot of sense for them to decry the persecution of the prophets of old, but yet give chase to the apostles and other followers of Jesus Christ after Jesus Christ leaves the scene. Okay, so the fact that they would go after them makes them just as much responsible for the blood of that generation and the previous generation as it was of their forefathers that came before them. Okay, so again, very, very strong words, very strong language here. And so going on further here in chapter 23 and in verse 37, Jesus says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the cities that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing." Now listen to this. "See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" Okay. Which is interesting, because I think that was part of the refrain that they were saying when Jesus came in to Jerusalem in his triumphal entry. So if that's the case, what's he talking about here? Until you actually say it with pure, changed hearts, which obviously that didn't make up the case for a lot of the Jews of that time. But going back to verse 38 there, it says, "See, your house is left to you desolate." Now, people who would have heard that, they think desolation. I don't think they would have understood right away that what Jesus was talking about at that time, as far as desolation, was the complete destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. They wouldn't have equated desolation to that. If anything, they probably would have equated desolation to what happened to the temple during the time of Antiochus IV. When he sacrificed a pig on the altar and raised a statue of Zeus in the temple, and that made that desolate. The temple wasn't destroyed, but the temple was defiled to the point where the Jews deserted the temple, and the temple was left desolate. And if anything, I think people who would have heard Jesus say these things would have equated desolation to what happened in 167 BC. Okay. They wouldn't have had an understanding at that time that what Jesus was talking about was the complete, utter destruction of the temple. Now, how do we know that Jesus is talking about the complete, utter destruction of the temple? We know that because that's what Jesus tells the disciples about, in the very next chapter. So after all of this is going on, we get into chapter 24. And so here's where we kind of get into the whole thing of the Olivet Discourse. Now, what leads Jesus to tell this discourse to his disciples is the questions that are asked in the first few verses here. So in chapter 24, still in Matthew, it says here, "Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point to him the buildings of the temple." I believe it's in Mark's version where they're actually saying, "Hey, look, Master, what wonderful stones and what magnificent buildings." And actually, it really was. The temple that was situated on the Temple Mount was a very imposing structure, and it was hard to miss. And it gleamed in the sunlight, with its stones and the marble and the gold. There was gold that was part of this structure as well. So it was a very beautiful, magnificent sort of thing. Now the disciples have seen the temple before, but these men, being from Galilee, I mean, it's not like they saw the temple every day because they didn't live in Jerusalem, but they did come to Jerusalem for the feasts. So I'm pretty sure that, always coming from the north and coming to the south, there was always a beholdment to see the temple every time they came and visited Jerusalem. So they're pointing these things out to Jesus as they've left the temple. And so here's what Jesus says in response in verse 2 of Matthew 24. He says, "But he answered them, you see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Okay. What? If we want to know what, what Jesus is meaning here by desolation, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about this whole thing of, the desolation of the temple is going to mean that it's utter fall, it's utter destruction, to the point where there's not one stone left upon another. Now, granted, Jesus uses the whole line of not one stone left upon another as it relates to the entire city of Jerusalem. But it is interesting that when it came to the temple and the destruction of the temple itself, that literally happened, where not one stone of that temple was left on another. Just given the fact that after the temple was burned down and a lot of the gold residue was melted in between the stones, you had a lot of the people in the Roman army who was separating those stones to get to that gold. And so that's really what you had there, with not one stone left upon another. Now, I mentioned the Romans here just a couple of seconds ago. If, in case you're not aware of this, what Jesus is referring to is something that would eventually become fulfilled about 40 years later, in the year 70 A.D., when the temple would be destroyed by the Roman army. And in fact, not only the temple, but the entire city of Jerusalem would fall to the Romans as well. And it was a very horrific time. And in fact, you get a sense of the whole thing of how the whole city is in danger when you look at Luke chapter 19. I want to say verses 41 through 44. Okay, and in there, Jesus' language shows that we're dealing with something more than just the temple itself, although that would be a structure that would fall down, but the entire city of Jerusalem would be in trouble. So the Roman general Titus would be the one that would lead the charge in this siege against the city of Jerusalem. The siege actually happened and started taking place before 70 A.D. But when it comes to 70 A.D., the siege put so much pressure on Jerusalem that it came to its tipping point. And then if you read some of the historical accounts of this, most notably the account written down by Josephus, who was an actual eyewitness of everything that happened here, you understand that this was a very horrific thing that happened in Jerusalem. A lot of blood, a lot of loss of life. One of the things that he mentions there is that there are some people who died not even from the slaying of the Romans, but from starvation. Because remember, again, when you're talking about a siege, you're not able to go in or out. Food's not able to come in or out. There comes a point where you run out of food. Now, those people who did survive and were still hungry, the Romans went around. They were just slashing people all over the place. It was very violent. It was very horrific. Crucifixions during that time was on an unbelievable scale. Okay, but so the whole city of Jerusalem would be in trouble. But you also see, and as a central point of this whole thing of the destruction of the temple. That's what happens in 70 A.D. Okay, now Jesus says this whole thing about the temple, about not one stone being left on top of another, and that all of it's going to be thrown down. So when you get into verse 3 of Matthew, it says this. It says, as he, Jesus, sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Okay. Now, these are very natural questions. I mean, after hearing what Jesus just said, you can't blame the disciples for asking this question. The when question is unique. Is common rather in all three of the accounts in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. understandably so. If this is something where you're saying that the temple is going to be destroyed and not one stone is going to be left on top of another, naturally we would want to know, hey, when's this whole thing going down? Okay. Now here with Matthew, I think it gives a little bit of helpful insight into what other things the disciples were wondering about. I think in Mark it talks about in what is the sign that this is all going to be fulfilled. That sort of thing. Here in Matthew, you have this whole thing of fulfillment diverging into two different questions here. Two questions that are intimately tied and linked together. Okay, so you have there the one thing after the when. After they ask the when, they ask, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Okay, now what's this whole thing when they say what is the sign of your coming? Well, I can tell you what it doesn't mean. And this is important for us to understand, because when we think of coming, and especially given the context of what we're looking at here, especially Matthew 24, Olivet Discourse, we think, okay, eschatology, coming of Jesus Christ, and that sort of thing. So when we hear the disciples' question, we might think of coming along the same lines and think that that's what they're asking about. But really, their asking of coming is slightly different. Now, Jesus is going to talk about his own actual coming as we do understand it, as coming down from heaven, right? But that's not what's on the disciples' radar screen. That's not what the disciples are talking about. They don't have any sort of concept. And you get this clue even when Jesus predicts his death and his resurrection and things. They don't even have a concept of that, even though that's what's been told them. Their whole idea of the Messiah and their understanding of the Messiah is no different than any contemporary Jew at that time. They would have been ones who would expect the Messiah to come and wipe out all of the enemies of the kingdom, most of those probably being Gentiles, and then to set up his kingdom in Jerusalem in perfect peace and righteousness. That's what they expected. That's what all the Jews expected of the Messiah. The thing is, everybody else didn't really accept Jesus as that actual Christ, as that actual Messiah. Some did, but certainly not everybody. A large majority of the people would reject him in that way. But the disciples saw him as the true actual Christ, the long-awaited Messiah. Okay, and so that's what they're looking for. So their whole thinking of Jesus, and this is why his whole prediction of his death was so hard for them to embrace, and that's why even you have Peter earlier on in Matthew chapter 16 when Jesus predicts his death, where Peter says that will never happen to you, which leads Jesus to say, "Get behind me, Satan." But they had no concept of a whole thing of, number one, as I said, Jesus actually being put to death, being raised to life, even though Jesus predicted that. I mean, it seemed like their minds just couldn't wrap around that. And if their minds couldn't wrap around that, it certainly wouldn't wrap around this whole thing of Jesus ascending to heaven and being in heaven for at least 2,000 years, and then at some point, of which day and hour we don't know, he descends on the clouds in final victory to judge sinners and to make all things new. Okay, that's not in their mental database. Okay, in fact, Jesus doesn't really explicitly tell them that he's going away to the Father until the upper room discourse. I believe you can see that in John chapter 14, which he says after this point here, the Olivet Discourse. So their whole thing of coming, what is the sign of your coming, is not the same sort of coming that we understand it. That word coming that Matthew uses in the Greek literally means presence. So they're talking about what is the sign of your presence. Now that might still raise some eyebrows, because you say, well, why would they ask about his presence? They're in his presence right now. So isn't that kind of a weird question? What they're meaning by presence here is they're meaning his presence in the full victorious messianic sense. Again, something that many of the Jews back at that time would have been expecting at that time. Okay, so they would have been expecting, with the coming of the actual Messiah. Okay, so when the Messiah comes in and rules in perfect peace and righteousness after abolishing all of his enemies, that in the Jewish mind and in the disciples' minds would have equated to his messianic presence. And that's what they were looking for. So that's what they're meaning by coming, not the whole thing of him coming on the clouds of heaven. Even though we know that's going to happen, we know that that's true, and Jesus is going to describe as much later on in his discourse. Okay, but just understand it's important for us to see what the disciples are asking and how they're seeing this from their perspective. Okay, so that's what they're meaning by his coming. What is the sign of your messianic presence in full victory is what they're asking. And tied into that, again, the second part of that question is intimately tied into the first, where it says, and of the end of the age. So they're asking about the sign of his coming and of the end of the age. Now, the whole thing of the end of the age, that's not a term that they're just pulling out of thin air. Okay, the end of the age, they've heard is the time that is spoken of and that they would have understood to be of that final victory that the Messiah would bring in, and what we would understand to be the end of human history that leads into the eternal state, right? And this is something that Jesus actually talked about and actually taught his disciples. Jesus taught about the end of the age. One of the big places that you see that in the Gospels is places like Matthew chapter 13. That whole chapter is dealing with parables and teachings about the end of the age and the kingdom the kingdom, but he talks about the end of the age later on in that chapter. Now, he tells a parable about the weeds. There's a parable that he tells. Let me read it here in Matthew chapter 13. And in verse 24 and following, he says, he put another parable before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed seeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also. And the servants of the master of the house came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds? He said to them, An enemy has done this. So the servants said to him, Then do you want us to go and gather them? But he said, No, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. Okay, so that's the parable. Okay, and so he says a few other things here in some in-between verses here, in verses 31 through 35. But when you get to verse 36, listen to what it says. Here's where Jesus is going to explain what he meant by that parable, the parable of the weeds. So in verse 36, it says, Then he left the crowds and went into the house. And his disciples came to him, saying, Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field. He answered, The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed is the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so will it be at the end of the age. So there it is. He's making the connection there with the end of the age. This is what happens at the end of the age. So the disciples themselves are personally internalizing this here. Verse 41, the Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers, and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. Okay, so that's how he explains the weeds, and he connects that whole thing to the end of the age. He makes another comparison here of a parable. He tells a parable and gives the explanation. It's a different illustration, but the same point in verse 47 through 50. Where he says, Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind. When it was full, men drew it ashore and sat down and sorted the good into containers, but threw away the bad. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the fiery furnace. in that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So again, there's a separation there at the end of the age. Okay, and that's what he's referring to there. He says that he says that outright. So it will be at the end of the age. So this sort of thing is very familiar to us. I mean, this is along the lines of the sheep and the goats that we read about in Matthew 25. That's part of Matthew 25. That's part of the extended version of the Olivet Discourse that Matthew gives. That isn't in the other accounts, and I don't go into detail on that portion in my book. But the sense that you get is you get final judgment and final salvation. Judgment on those who reject Christ and have rejected the gospel, and salvation for those who are His and who get to, by virtue of being in Christ, can enjoy the kingdom. Okay, that's their understanding of the end of the age. So they hear what Jesus says here about not one stone being left on top of another. And it's interesting that when they hear that, they ask about the end of the age. So what's this whole thing? So they're thinking that the destruction of the temple must be in connection to what's going to happen at the end of the age, at the end of human history. Now, let me let you in on something. That's not how I've heard a lot of people describe that. Because the thing is that a lot of people interpret the disciples' reaction to what Jesus says about not one stone being left on top of another, and they attribute to the disciples shock and horror and just kind of, this is hard to believe, because the thinking would go in their minds is that the temple is such an important structure in Jewish life, in the Jewish system. Okay. And, because of that, and because of their own expectation, which is no different than any other contemporary Jew about the coming of the Messiah, one would think that in order for this to carry on and go through, that the temple would have to be there, and the temple would have to be intact in order for this whole thing to work. So a lot of people explain this as, hey, the disciples are shocked and they can't believe this. So they rush to Jesus and say, what is the sign of this, that this is going to happen, and of the end of the age, sort of in a whole thing of, I'm so shocked, I have to know more about this whole thing. I don't think that's the disciples' attitude. If anything, I think that their attitude is one of unrestrained hope, because we have to understand and we have to think about how the disciples would have seen the temple, which, by the way, Jesus said that the Jewish religious leaders had turned into a den of robbers, right? This temple tied so much into a Jewish system run by Jewish religious leaders that have been constantly on Jesus's case since the beginning of his ministry, all the time, and so much to the point that the disciples, in their mere association with Jesus, resulted in them receiving grief from the Pharisees as well. For example, when they were picking heads of grain and eating them, the Pharisees come along and asking the disciples, hey, look at what they're doing. They're doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. So they're pointing the accusative finger at the disciples and coming after the disciples and saying, hey, look, Jesus, you see what they're doing? They are breaking the Sabbath. Same thing with washing their hands. They ask, hey, look at your disciples. Why do they eat with unwashed hands? So the disciples weren't ones who escaped the scrutiny of the teachers of the law and everything like that. They didn't escape that at all. So I think the disciples knew very much that these people, these leaders who made up this corrupt Jewish system that was so tied into the temple, was due for destruction. So the end of the age, and what Jesus had described as the end of the age, I don't think it's hard to believe that the disciples would consider the corrupt Jewish leaders and the people who followed them as part of the bad fish that would be thrown away. Okay. And so really, I think when they hear that not one stone is going to be left on top of another, that's how the end of the age clicks in their mind. They think, okay, righteous judgment is going to come. We just want to know when that will happen and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age. When is this whole thing is going to be? When is that going to happen? And so basically what you have is this. They equate the destruction of the temple as the end of the age. What Jesus is going to say as he starts out in this discourse is he's saying, no, the destruction of the temple does not signal that it's the end of the age, but it does serve as a signal, as a preview of what's going to happen when the end of the age actually comes. You have all sorts of things that you're going to see as signs, but the end is not yet, okay? But he does give them the signs, okay? And so that's what launches Jesus into this whole thing of the Olivet Discourse. Now, he does talk about the temple, and he does spend a good deal, portion of his discourse talking about what happens at the temple, and I believe that that's what he's talking about as far as the temple there, is the temple in Jerusalem at that time in the first century that would be destroyed in 70 AD, okay? And I have a whole chapter that talks about that and how to interpret those that passage. But what I want to do here is I want to read an excerpt from my book here. This is still part of the first chapter that kind of winds everything together as I take the readers and I start to introduce them into what will be happening and what Jesus is going to talk about with in the Olivet Discourse. And so it says here. It says this. It says, I truly believe that when the disciples asked Jesus what, some of this is a repeat of what I just said, but it says here, I truly believe that when the disciples asked Jesus what would be the signs of the end of the age, they are accessing the descriptions of the end of the age from their mental databases. Knowing what Jesus had said earlier about the end of the age, I wouldn't be surprised if their question was one of unrestrained hope. It is one that seems to conveniently gloss over the previous predictions from Christ himself that he would have to be put to death. That doesn't seem to be a couple of questions asked out of shock and disbelief, as if the destruction of the temple would be a hindrance to the long-awaited kingdom being established. With the temple being so tied to the contemporary wicked religious system, plus what the disciples witnessed in the tension between Jesus and the religious leaders, as well as what they themselves experienced being under scrutiny, I think Jesus' mention of the temple's destruction seemed quite natural. Not only that, but the disciples would have known that the religious leaders who were opposed to Jesus had no place in the kingdom. After all, the disciples had just heard Jesus say that very thing in one of his woes in Matthew 23. Here's where I quote a verse here. It says, "But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. For you neither enter yourselves, nor allow those who would enter to go in." And that's verses 13 and 14 of Matthew 23. But continuing, it says, "Thus, if the disciples are looking for the kingdom to be established, and they know that the temple that is tied to a religious system run by leaders who do not enter that kingdom will be destroyed, their question about the end of the age seems to be appropriate. The disciples saw themselves as the good fish, while those who made up the false Jewish religious system were the bad fish who would be tossed into the fiery furnace at the end of the age. To put everything in simple terms, the disciples thought that the destruction of the temple signified that this would immediately usher in the end of the age that they had heard Jesus speak about. But as Jesus answers their questions, launching into the Olivet Discourse, we see that Jesus corrects the inaccurate mindset they held about the whole thing. The destruction of the temple did not signal the end of the age, but it would serve as a sneak preview of judgment to come at the second coming of Christ. To understand the flow of Jesus' discourse here, we have to divide it up into 4 parts. 1. General events throughout human history that must take place before the end of the age. 2. Signs that immediately precede the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in AD 70. This section of the discourse is very important because popular interpretations assert that Jesus is talking about events that will happen in Jerusalem immediately preceding the second coming of Christ, not the sacking of Jerusalem in AD 70. As I will note in our discussion of that section, there is no biblical basis for looking at this from a futurist perspective. 3. The actual appearing of Christ, that is, his second coming. And 4. Our response as followers of Christ in light of these truths. And I'll just end the quote there. So that's me just kind of launching us into things as we just covered the background of everything here. So those are and those four things that I laid out there, I think are the right ways of dividing up this discourse. And so it talks about the whole thing about the temple, when in the world is going on, and what sort of things happen when this whole thing of the destruction of the temple takes place. The whole thing about Jesus coming on the clouds of heaven. Believe it or not, some people don't believe that that's Jesus talking about his actual second coming, but it means his coming in judgment in Jerusalem in AD 70. And while I do believe that the discourse mentions the things that are going to happen in AD 70, I think we have to make accurate divisions as far as what Jesus is talking about, what he's talking about in that contemporary first century situation, and what we look forward to as far as it relates to his future Perusia. Okay, and so this book attempts to navigate through all of those things, and just kind of laying out what some of the common interpretations are, and some of the reasons why I believe that some of those interpretations don't really hold a lot of water biblically. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the whole goal is to unpack this passage verse by verse. Okay, and that's what we do. And because I know that some of the things that are laid out there raise certain questions, certain big questions. There are certain areas in the book where I pause and address certain issues there, so that readers can understand why I hold the views that I do. Okay, but my hope is that this serves as a very interesting read to anybody who would pick this up and read it. And so I would encourage you to order your copy of my book, Signs of the End. We're going to leave it there. I'm going to leave it there with the background information, and hope that whets your appetite for reading the book, which is a more in-depth study of what Jesus says following that. Now, we've talked about on this program, in short form, I would say, the Olivet Discourse, because remember, if you've been with us in our study of the book of Revelation, remember we were looking at some of the connections, the similarities that we see between the Olivet Discourse and what we see with the breaking of the six seals in Revelation chapter 6. Remember that? And so in order to make the case for that, I had to describe a little bit about what my thoughts were of the Olivet Discourse, but I know that it wasn't a full analysis of that. So if you were part of that group of people that was listening to that and recognize that there are gaps in there because I can't explain the whole thing, well, then pick up my book, because it will fill in the gaps for you as it relates to that. Okay. So again, the title is Signs of the End. What did Jesus say about his own return and the events that point to it? By me, Steve Gill. You can order a copy on Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com. So go there, order yourself a copy, and hopefully have a good, enjoyable read. Okay, so we will leave it there. I hope I'm not leaving anything out here as far as things that I want to say or need to say or whatever. But we'll leave it there. And so we will, and I'm pretty sure we will this time, we will go into and start looking at Revelation chapter 11 next time. Okay. So looking forward to that, and getting back into Revelation. Revelation there's a lot of it that's been good, but you go into it, it's like, man, this is really starting to get good here. So we're looking forward to unpacking a lot of interesting things. Like I said, we're going to be covering some things in the next several weeks that I know a lot of people have questions about. And some people are sure about what they believe in certain things, but I think that they're misunderstanding, misinterpretations, or misguided on how to understand certain things. So I'll be looking forward to covering that as well, and looking at things biblically. We're going to draw everything from Scripture, okay, and look at what Scripture has to say, do some comparisons here and there with other parts of Scripture to come to a right understanding of what we're dealing with in those parts of Revelation. Okay, so we will leave it there. If you enjoy this show, and you haven't done so already, I would encourage you to subscribe to my show on Apple Podcasts. You can also do so on iHeartRadio, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also follow me, Steve Gill, on Twitter. My handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS. which stands for Loving the Scriptures. All right, so again, one more time, go out and get a copy of Signs of the End by me, Steve Gill. Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com is where you can get that right now. So really enjoyed this time and just going over some of these things with you. I hope you enjoyed it as well. And obviously, I hope that it interests you enough for you to go and get a copy of my book. So anyway, great time in the Word and examining these things with you. I always enjoy doing that with all of you. My name is Steve Gill, and I will see you right back here next time. Bye now.